Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SB 1383 Edible Food Recovery Capacity Planning Tools webinar. My name is Martine Boswell, and I am one of the many individuals that contributed to the development of the tools that we are going to present today in this webinar. So to begin, I'd first like to introduce you to some of the organizers of this webinar, to all the CalRecycle folks that are organizers. If you could turn your cameras on and please wave your hand as I introduce you. So we'll start with Kara Morgan. There's Kara, Kyle Pogue, Tim Hall, and then we have Laura Moreno. She is our expert on the guidance document that will be covered in today's webinar. Chris Bria, who is the lead and expert on the calculator tool that was developed. And then we also have Jeffrey McDaniel. All of these folks will be able to assist with answering questions. And again, I'm Martine, and I'll be able to answer any questions that you have about the capacity planning survey. So thank you to all the CalRecycle folks, and we'll begin now. And I apologize, the slide is taking a moment to advance. Okay. So for some logistics, please see the current slide. We will have a question and answer portion after every tool that's presented, and at the end of this webinar if there is time. Please use the questions feature in the webinar, and CalRecycle staff will call on you to unmute you during the designated Q&A sessions. You will need to restate your question, even if it's already been answered in the questions feature, as we may have some listening in via the broadcast link, so they will not be able to see your questions. And we will go over this again during each of the Q&A sessions, so you have a reminder on the process. This slide shows each item that we will cover in today's webinar. We will begin by sharing CalRecycle's disclaimer about the use of the edible food recovery capacity planning tools. Then we will set the context to help explain why edible food recovery capacity planning is critical. After that, we will cover each of the tools, starting with the edible food recovery capacity planning survey first, the calculator tool second, and the guidance document last. After covering each tool, we will have a brief question and answer session to answer questions specific to that tool. Please be aware that we hope to have more time at the end of this presentation to answer any final questions that you may have. We will begin by sharing CalRecycle's disclaimer regarding the use of the documents that will be discussed in this presentation. This disclaimer is included in each document, which I also will sometimes refer to as a tool. And this disclaimer specifies that the use of these documents are optional and are not an enforceable regulatory requirement and do not ensure regulatory compliance if they are used. We highly encourage you to read the disclaimer in its entirety before using any of the documents discussed in this webinar. Now, before we discuss anything about edible food recovery capacity planning, it's very important that we first set the context to help explain why edible food recovery capacity planning is critical. And in order to understand this, we first need to talk about the amount of potentially donatable food that's disposed in California each year. In 2018, CalRecycle conducted a disposal facility-based waste characterization study that separated disposed food materials into 8 categories based on edibility, recoverability, and food type. The figure on the left gives a high-level overview of the food material categories used in this study. This figure will be discussed in detail later in the presentation, but what is important to note here is that in the 2018 waste characterization study, we measured the amount of potentially donatable food that is disposed in California each year. The figure on the right shows some of the key results from the study. Specifically, the figure on the right shows that over 1 million tons, and I want to emphasize the word tons, of potentially donatable food were disposed in landfills in 2018. Translating that into meals, it is approximately 1.8 billion meals per year that could have potentially been recovered, but instead were disposed. Again, that number is 1.8 billion meals per year that are being sent to landfill, and this was potentially donatable food. This relates to capacity planning because now that we know that over 1 million tons of potentially donatable food are being disposed each year, we need to take action to ensure that there is sufficient capacity to be able to recover this food so that it does not end up in landfills, but rather is redirected to its highest and best use of helping feed people in need. To further illustrate the issue, I would like to share this photo that tells an important story about food waste in California. The photo on this slide was taken in downtown Los Angeles, and what I learned when I witnessed this food waste was that everything in this dumpster was going to be sent to a landfill, and that the dumpster needed to be emptied multiple times each day, and that this was occurring nearly every day. What you can't see from the photo is that there was another dumpster the same size next to this one, also filled with tomatoes, and behind me were pallets and boxes filled with fresh produce that would all end up in these dumpsters. The great tragedy here is that the food vendors at this facility tried to donate as much of this as possible, but the food recovery organization that they work with, which also happens to be one of the largest produce recovery organizations in California, was at full capacity that day and could not accept any more food. So this highlights a critical issue that we have in California, where oftentimes there are significant amounts of food available for food recovery, but the capacity to recover the food and distribute it to the community is lacking. And without proper capacity planning, we will continue to see over 1 million tons of potentially donatable food ending up in our landfills. For these reasons, SB 1383's regulations include critical capacity planning requirements. The documents that we will cover in this webinar can all be used to help you meet these critical requirements. One final point about this serious issue is that while millions of pounds of recoverable food are being disposed, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, hunger doubled in California, and in some areas it tripled. This is an aerial photo of a line of cars in Los Angeles waiting to receive food from a food distribution site last year. The red line shows the line of cars waiting for food. Yet another reason why assessing edible food recovery capacity and building capacity where it is needed most is absolutely critical. So now that we've set the context, we will now cover the SB 1383 Edible Food Recovery Goal and the Edible Food Recovery Capacity Planning regulatory requirements. SB 1383's statute, so the law, included the goal that not less than 20% of currently disposed edible food must be recovered for human consumption by 2025. The law also required CalRecycle to adopt regulations intended to help achieve this 20% edible food recovery goal. The regulatory requirements that I am about to cover were all developed specifically to help California achieve this goal. Please be aware that this is a statewide goal that California must collectively achieve. So we have this 20% edible food recovery goal, but what does edible food mean? How is it defined in the context of SB 1383? Well, in the SB 1383 regulations, edible food is defined as food intended for human consumption. The regulatory definition also specifies, however, that nothing in the regulations requires or authorizes the recovery of edible food that does not meet the food safety requirements of the California Retail Food Code. Therefore, in order for food to be considered edible under SB 1383, the food must be intended for human consumption and also meet all of the food safety requirements of the California Retail Food Code. So that's an important note about that definition. Now that we've discussed California's edible food recovery goal and how edible food recovery and how edible food is defined, we will now provide an overview of SB 1383's edible food recovery capacity planning requirements. The SB 1383 regulations require counties and each jurisdiction located within the county, meaning cities, regional agencies, and special districts that provide solid waste collection services, to plan for adequate edible food recovery capacity. The county will lead this effort by coordinating with jurisdictions that are located within the county, collecting and aggregating the data from all of the jurisdictions that are located in the county, and reporting the information back to CalRecycle. The regulations specify that each jurisdiction is required to do the following in order to complete their capacity planning analysis. First, jurisdictions must estimate the amount of edible food that will be disposed by Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators located in the jurisdiction. To calculate this, jurisdictions will first need to identify their Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators. CalRecycle developed a guidance document on approaches that jurisdictions can use to help them complete this task. The link to the webpage with this document will be provided at the end of the presentation. CalRecycle also developed a calculator tool to assist jurisdictions with estimating the amount of edible food that will be disposed by their generators. This calculator and a guidance document explaining how to use the calculator will be discussed in detail later in this webinar. The second part of the capacity planning analysis involves identifying existing capacity at food recovery organizations and food recovery services that is available to commercial edible food generators located in the county. CalRecycle published an edible food recovery capacity planning survey that provides jurisdictions with guidance on how to collect information from food recovery organizations and food recovery services, and also includes a customizable survey itself that can be used to help gather information on current capacity. This survey document will also be covered in more detail during this webinar. Please be aware that in order to comply with these requirements, the county, in coordination with each jurisdiction, is required to consult with food recovery organizations and services about their current capacity and capacity needs. With this collaboration, these organizations can inform the jurisdictions about their current capacity and what would be needed most to expand or create new capacity if that's something that they're interested in doing. Food recovery organizations and services that are contacted by a jurisdiction must respond to the jurisdiction within 60 days regarding available and potential new or expanded capacity. This helps jurisdictions conduct a collaborative and impactful edible food recovery capacity planning analysis in a timely manner. In addition, the regulations also require jurisdictions to identify proposed new or expanded food recovery organizations and food recovery services that could be used to recover the amount of edible food that's estimated to be disposed. So to clarify, this requirement is a little different because it's not about assessing your current edible food recovery capacity. It involves assessing the amount of proposed new or expanded capacity that could potentially become available to the commercial edible food generators. Approaches to complying with this requirement include communicating with existing food recovery organizations and food recovery services to find out if they plan on expanding. The survey document that CalRecycle developed and will be discussed later in this webinar includes questions that can help jurisdictions gather data to answer this question. The final SB 1383 requirement for completing a capacity planning analysis is to identify the amount, if any, of new or expanded edible food recovery capacity that is needed to recover the amount of edible food that is estimated to be disposed by the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators located in the jurisdiction. So for a brief review on the key edible food recovery capacity planning requirements, jurisdictions first need to estimate the amount of edible food that will be disposed by their generators in the jurisdiction. Then jurisdictions will have to assess their current edible food recovery capacity and also assess the amount of proposed new or expanded edible food recovery capacity that could become available to generators in the jurisdiction. Using the information collected, jurisdictions will then need to determine if they have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that is estimated to be disposed. Each of the tools that will be discussed in this webinar are intended to assist jurisdictions with meeting these requirements. Please note that because this effort requires the county to submit a report to CalRecycle, each jurisdiction that is contacted by county staff must respond to the request for information within 120 days. This timeline ensures that the county staff can submit all of the capacity planning information to CalRecycle in the time required by the regulation. If this timeline is not met, the county does not need to include edible food recovery estimates for that jurisdiction in its report to CalRecycle. However, the county must include in its report any jurisdictions that did not provide the necessary information to comply with the requirements. This is necessary because the county can be penalized financially for failing to estimate edible food recovery capacity, and this clarifies that the county is not liable if any of the cities located in the county fail to respond within the given time frame. If a jurisdiction's capacity planning analysis shows that they do not have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that is estimated to be disposed, then each jurisdiction that lacks adequate capacity they are then required to submit an implementation schedule to CalRecycle that demonstrates how they will ensure enough new or expanded capacity to recover the amount of edible food that's currently being disposed by the generators. They need to do this by the end of the reporting period. The implementation schedule must include timelines and milestones for these capacity planning efforts. This includes timelines and milestones for obtaining funding for edible food recovery infrastructure. This can potentially be done through modifying franchise agreements or demonstrating other means of financially supporting the expansion of edible food recovery capacity. They also need to identify timelines and milestones for the identification of facilities, operations, or activities that could be used to expand edible food recovery capacity. Each jurisdiction is required to consult with food recovery organizations and services regarding existing, new, or proposed capacity that could be accessed by the jurisdiction's commercial edible food generators. Jurisdictions can decide how they want to coordinate this activity. And please be aware that there are no waivers for edible food recovery, so all jurisdictions must plan and submit the required data. That concludes our overview of the edible food recovery capacity planning requirements. The remainder of today's webinar will be split into multiple sections, each with its own Q&A. We will begin by discussing the edible food recovery capacity planning survey. SB 1383 regulations require counties, in coordination with jurisdictions and regional agencies located within the county, to identify existing, proposed new, or expanded capacity of food recovery organizations and services that is or will be available to commercial edible food generators located in the jurisdiction. So how can a jurisdiction assess the amount of edible food recovery capacity that is available to commercial edible food generators? Well, one way to complete this analysis is through distributing an electronic survey that is specifically focused on gathering information about food recovery organizations and food recovery services' current food recovery capacity, and what would be needed most to expand that capacity. The survey that I am about to discuss is a tool that was designed specifically to assist counties and jurisdictions in their efforts to achieve this critical task. Before we go over the survey document, however, we would first like to show some examples of what is meant by the term capacity in the context of edible food recovery. This slide shows photos provided by several CalRecycle food waste prevention and rescue grant recipients. Each photo provides an example of something that was funded in total or in part using CalRecycle grant funds, specifically so that the organization could increase their capacity to recover more edible food. Things that can help a food recovery organization increase their capacity to rescue more food include, but are not limited to, large refrigerated trucks, refrigerated vans, cold storage, increased warehouse space, paid staff, volunteers, kitchen equipment, bins and crates, food donation matching software, and much more. In order to assess edible food recovery capacity, jurisdictions must consult with food recovery organizations and services to learn more about the total pounds of food that they're currently recovering directly from food donors, and what would be needed most for them to be able to increase their capacity to rescue more food. CalRecycle has developed a customizable survey that is designed to assist counties and jurisdictions in their efforts to assess the amount of food recovery capacity that is available to commercial edible food generators in the jurisdiction. This slide shows the first page of the survey document. The first few pages of the survey document contain information about the purpose of the survey, an overview of the SB 1383 edible food recovery capacity planning requirements, information about survey distribution, survey confidentiality, and a disclaimer for the use of the tool. We highly encourage you to read these sections before using the survey. It is very important to note that this survey is a companion piece to the Edible Food Recovery Calculator tool that will be discussed in more detail later in this webinar. For example, the Edible Food Recovery Calculator will help jurisdictions estimate the amount of edible food disposed by commercial edible food generators in the jurisdiction. This survey can then be used to help jurisdictions determine if they have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that is estimated to be disposed. As I previously mentioned, the survey document includes information about confidentiality. Specifically, the document states that those responsible for administering the survey may need to evaluate the need for confidentiality of survey responses. The reason for this is because survey respondents may have concerns regarding the confidentiality of the information they provide, and they may seek assurances that the information they provide will not be shared with other food recovery organizations and services or others in general. Jurisdictions may consider exploring methods to ensure confidentiality as a method to increase survey responsiveness. This slide shows the first page of survey questions within the survey document. Jurisdictions can customize the survey by adding, removing, or editing questions, and then sending it out to local food recovery organizations and services to collect information about current food recovery capacity within the jurisdiction. I would like to bring your attention to the yellow highlights that you see on this screen. Throughout the survey, we have included tips and guidance for how to write and program questions in electronic surveys such as Google Forms, for example. These important notes for the survey host are highlighted in yellow. And the survey hosts, those are the individuals that are administering the survey, sending them out to potential respondents. So on this slide, for example, the highlighted note to the survey host could say, if you are using an electronic survey, for example, Google Forms, the response option should be in checkboxes form where multiple boxes can be selected. So that's an important note to just be mindful of if you choose to use this survey. We encourage you to consider using an electronic survey that best suits your specific needs, including data needs. Electronic surveys provide many benefits, such as the ability to reach a large group quickly, ease of data collection, automation in data input and handling, and the potential increase in response rates. A few potential options for electronic surveys that can be used, but of course do not have to be used, are Google Forms, Qualtrics, and SurveyMonkey, to provide a few examples. Google Forms is free for users. Qualtrics, I believe, does provide a free 30-day trial, and SurveyMonkey charges for advanced features and resources. As a reminder, these are options that are available to you, but none of them are required. It is important to note that those responsible for distributing the survey may want to consider preventing food recovery organizations and food recovery services from receiving the same survey multiple times. as many food recovery organizations have limited time and resources available. If counties choose to use this optional survey, they should consider coordinating with all of the jurisdictions in the county regarding how best to distribute the survey, collect responses, and report information back to CalRecycle. Consider providing these surveys in such a manner as to promote participation from food recovery organizations and services and ensure their collaboration with jurisdictions. One potential strategy for this could be having a specific individual first reach out to the local food bank and provide the food bank with information about the purpose of the survey and the survey itself so that the food bank can see what types of questions are asked. The food bank might then be able to determine if they can complete the survey, not just for the food bank, but also for some of their partnering feeding agencies. For those unfamiliar with food banks, many food banks typically work with, in some cases, hundreds of smaller feeding agencies in their area that provide rescued food directly to individuals in the community. Food banks help facilitate these donations of food directly to their partnering feeding agencies. And oftentimes, the food that is rescued by the feeding agency is then reported back to the food bank. So there's an opportunity there where the food bank might be able to wrap up some of that reporting in a single survey. While this process may help with efficiency and data management, it is important to be aware that some feeding agencies that partner with food banks also rescue food outside of their partnership with the food bank. In addition, not all food rescue organizations and food recovery services partner with the local food bank, and their capacity and capacity needs are separate and distinct from that of the food banks. As a result, only distributing this survey to your local food bank very likely will not capture all of the information necessary for completing your capacity planning analysis. So while the local food bank can potentially be a good starting point, it's very possible and very likely that you will need to administer this survey or distribute it to additional food recovery organizations and services to fully understand your capacity and capacity gaps. Please be aware that the regulations specify that entities that are contacted by the jurisdiction, so that is food recovery organizations and services, regarding their available and potential new or expanded capacity, must respond to the jurisdiction within 60 days. One final point that we would like to share about the survey is that some of the questions in the survey can also be used to assist jurisdictions with gathering information that will help them comply with the edible food recovery education and outreach requirements. For example, Section 18985.2 in the regulations requires jurisdictions to develop a list of food recovery organizations and services operating in the jurisdiction. The list must include specific information about each food recovery organization and service that is included, such as their name, address, contact information, food recovery collection service area, and an indication of the types of food accepted for food recovery. CalRecycle's Edible Food Recovery Capacity Planning Survey includes questions that address each of these points and can serve to help you collect information to include on your list of food recovery organizations and services, which again is a requirement for jurisdictions under Section 18985.2, Edible Food Recovery Education and Outreach. One final thing I'll clarify about this list is that it is not a requirement to list all food recovery organizations and services operating in the jurisdiction. The requirement is just that a list is developed. So keep that in mind. That concludes our overview of the Edible Food Recovery Capacity Planning Survey. Thank you so much for your time, for listening, and we will now be taking questions that are specific to the survey. So maybe Ray and Esmeralda, if you can read some of those that have come in.
Thank you. As a reminder, please use the instructions shown on the slide for the Q&A session. If you're using GoToWebinar platform and would like to ask a question, please type your question in the question pane. If you're watching the webinar via the Cal EPA broadcast, please email your questions to the SLCP inbox. Staff will unmute participants in the order that the questions come in. You will need to unmute yourself on your end when asked by the. Please state your affiliation before asking your question. And CalRecycle may respond to some questions in writing through GoToWebinar. With that, we received a number of questions from Monica White on the survey. You are now unmuted on our end. Please unmute yourself, state your affiliation and your questions.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Monica?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, perfectly. Okay. Sorry, I submitted these in writing, so I wasn't quite prepared to repeat them. So for the surveys, one of the questions that we had was since we know that some of the surveys may be difficult to get at 100% completion, is there a compliance requirement to have the surveys completed?
So the first thing I'll say is that the survey is one method that can be used to meet this requirement, but this tool, none of the tools we'll discuss in this webinar are required to be used. So if you have a different method, then that absolutely can be the path forward. However, with that, there are reporting requirements and set dates for those that you would need to report by. So I don't know if Kara has anything to add to that, but what's important is that the data is aggregated and reported back to CalRecycle by the county by that set reporting deadline that's specified in the regulations.
So if we were to use for like qualitative data to assess whether or not we feel that there's sufficient capacity or insufficient capacity, I guess we're just wanting to make sure that jurisdictions have a level of comfort to know where they might receive feedback that this is not enough information as they're completing their capacity studies.
Kara, can you answer that? That's a great question, Monica.
Yeah, Monica, you may have to give me a little more clarity, but at the bottom line, we'll see this later when we go over the calculator tool, is that each jurisdiction, each city, each county, a special district provides solid waste collection services, is going to need to quantify the available edible food capacity, either existing, new, or planned capacity, and that data has to go into the calculator tool or some calculation so that the jurisdictions can determine if they have adequate capacity to meet the needs of the commercial edible food generators. Does that answer your question? Monica? Are you there, Monica?
Sounds like we might have lost her.
Oh, sorry. I think that we're expecting to get a range of data where some is going to be very reliable and others maybe more qualitative. And so we're just trying to see what kind of guidance we could provide to jurisdictions to say that, for the first year of your capacity study, qualitative data is going to be okay or not. So maybe we'll give you some specifics.
Yeah, do you have like a specific example? Because I don't know where qualitative data would be sufficient. I don't see how that would meet the requirements. When we're talking about this is a quantitative calculation that's necessary. Now, the accuracy of it, again, this is a planning exercise. So, we have spoken many times to this fact that estimates are fine. This doesn't have to be exact, but it does have to be quantitative. So I'm not sure how a qualitative piece of information could be applied. Do you have an example?
Well, many pantries, for example, don't have scales to even measure how much food that they're receiving, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be based more of a discussion on, could you perhaps take on more generators or new generators to route? Could you take on more food? We're not going to have hard estimates of how much food that might be. We're not going to have the poundage exactly that they could take on for the first year. it'll be more an assessment of, yes, within their current staffing and infrastructure, we think that they can take on additional generators, or no, they don't. There's not going to be a lot of nothing beyond that until we get more scales and recording out there.
Yeah, Martine, do you want to tag in on this? Because again, it does require quantitative estimates. So it is going to require some kind of numeric estimate. Martine, do you have any thoughts on a food pantry and how they might estimate how much capacity they currently have? I think easy to say I've got 0 additional capacity that I can take on, but any ideas on how to estimate and what data?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, and you'll see this in the survey template, that sometimes we're asking questions where it is if you do not have this data, you might have to provide your best estimate, your best guess data. So, I'm sure that they have some sort of mechanism for estimating the pounds that they're recovering per year, because that's also an important metric to track in terms of, grants and funding, things like that. So really what Kara's saying is spot on about that quantitative aspect of this planning exercise, because the data that needs to be collected is really to answer, do we have sufficient capacity to recover the pounds that are estimated to be disposed? So one of the first things that you would need to do is really look at, okay, who are the organizations that we're going to survey? What are they recovering in pounds per year? And what does that equal to? Are we close? What do they need most to be able to expand capacity? For that pantry, what I think is very important is that they include, when I believe there's a question in the survey that asks, if you want to expand capacity, what would you need most to be able to rescue more food? And so there's an option where they can click other, and then they can also mention when they want to let the county know something else. All of this is included in that survey document. They could say, we don't have the ability to weigh the food. So right now, our biggest challenge is really understanding what our own capacity is. And that is another item, so scales, that can help them assess what they're currently doing and maybe even help them increase capacity. But maybe getting that scale requires additional time or an additional staff person. That would be another thing that they could include in their analysis. Ultimately, though, the important thing is that you're collecting data on the quantitative amount of food that's currently being rescued.
Okay, that does make sense. And I guess a part of it too, which I'm thinking will come later, is we did have some questions about the tier 1 and tier 2 generators and the gap analysis, because of course that's what we're looking at. And I think it really depends on that current gap, right? So if we know that there's only 3 tier 1s within a jurisdiction that needs to have service, then that is a very different question as we start looking at capacity too. So I'm just curious, from your guys' feedback always, what is going to pass muster? What are the things that we absolutely need? What are the things that we have a couple of years to sort of get our arms around? And certainly scales at pantries is going to be something that will take time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Monica.
Okay, the next question that we have is coming from Jennifer Gilbert regarding the Public Records Act. I will go ahead and unmute you. If you could also unmute yourself, state your affiliation, and then answer your question. You're unmuted on our end, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. So I, was looking through the tool and survey you provided. Thank you so much. And I know you mentioned that some of the food recovery organizations might be a little bit hesitant to answer some of these questions and to put something in there about, that we're going to keep this information confidential. And I get that some of the stuff, because it's talking about funding and such, that they might have some hesitations about that. However, we are government, and that is not exactly an option for us. So, while we could say, I'm not going to take this information and post it on the internet, technically I can't say that, because if someone comes to our city and say, I would like, doing a Public Records Act, request, I want all the information that the city has on this, technically that is posted on our website through the the transparency portal. So I can click on it from any computer and see exactly that information. So I'm curious how you intend for that to work, because I get that concern that a food recovery organization might have. So I'm curious if anybody has run into this and what advice you would give us in this circumstance of how, we can't keep this information private and if we're asked to release it.
Sure. So it's a great point. The reason why we added that information into the survey document about survey confidentiality was really just to help jurisdictions be more mindful that this could be a concern of some of the respondents. And that's why we use the language that jurisdictions may consider adding language about confidentiality. You don't have to. This is also something where if you're using, an outside agency that isn't government to complete these surveys or administer the survey, that could be something that they would use. So we did not want to omit it from the document. With that said, we're also state government, so we're very familiar with PRA. What we tried to do in the survey, and we worked very closely with key stakeholders on the development of the survey, was really making sure that the questions we're asking do not involve anything about sharing of donor names, things like that. These questions in the survey are not about proprietary food donation information, where the food recovery organization would be extremely sensitive about sharing that. So we were very careful about that. With that said, some food recovery organizations may have hesitations about sharing information about the pounds of food they recover. I think that the messaging around the survey is the most critical, and that is this survey is an opportunity for the food recovery organization to share with the jurisdiction essentially what they need most to be able to continue their operations and rescue more food. So there's a major opportunity there for them to be a part of this process. It's also an opportunity for the jurisdiction to see these are the organizations and services that we want part of our jurisdiction edible food recovery program. This is the organization we want to include on our list of food recovery organizations and services. So there's a major opportunity there. With that said, again, we recognize the issue with PRA, but you in that case do not need to include that survey confidentiality language when you're messaging about the survey.
And Martine, if I could just chime in, this is Ashley. This, Jennifer, has actually come up with other parts of 1383 as well, and other maybe third-party platforms and whatnot. And we actually consulted with our legal on what to do with this. So unfortunately, there are no blanket private protections in SB 1383 regulations. But we're really highly encouraging that jurisdictions work with their city council or county councils for consultations on strategies in protecting proprietary, confidential, or trade secret information. So I know that's not like the greatest advice, Jennifer, but that's what we're advising our jurisdictions to do, is to work with your own legal counsels for confidential information.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Yeah, I mean, we're just about ready to do this, survey all our folks, and I'm just wondering how much of an issue this is really going to be and trying to wrap my brain on how we're going to deal with that if we get the pushback. I mean, yeah, we can point to the regulations and say, well, you kind of actually have to tell us this stuff, but I don't like taking that, tact. Especially if they're really hesitant to share info. So I don't know how big of a deal it's been when jurisdictions have tried reaching out and, how much pushback they get. I'm too busy to fill this out. I don't want to give this information. Gee, I just don't know. I show up and I pick up food and then I just give it out at the farmer's market or whatever it is, right? So I'm just wanted to hear. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Perfect.
Yeah, one last point on that, Jennifer, because it's a very important point about the sensitivity around some of this information. In my experience working with food recovery organizations, they are very sensitive about sharing information about their food donors, the names of their food donors, the locations of their food donors. So that to them would be considered proprietary food donation information. And none of the questions in the survey are asking about anything like that. So For those listening to this webinar, asking a food recovery organization for a list of their food donors is not a good way to build trust with them. And it's really not going to be ultimately necessary for this planning exercise. You're trying to get more information about how many pounds are you recovering per year? What kind of capacity do you currently have? What kinds of food are you recovering? What would you need most to be able to recover more food? So building trust with them is critical. And also, you know, as we mentioned, they are required to reply. But I would just say, really emphasizing, we're not asking about proprietary food donation information. And this is so that we can help you to build capacity if that's something you want to do. That's really, it's a partnership here. All of this is about making sure that food is not going to waste, that it's getting redirected to people who need it. So when that trust is built and the partnership is there, I do think that, and you emphasize that this is an opportunity to be highlighted as part of our program. I think that the participation will be there. So thank you so much for asking that.
The next question is from Kristen Salas regarding ensuring that food banks aren't double counting their capacity through this submitting their own survey. You're now unmuted on our end. Please state your question and your affiliation. Okay, maybe we lost them. I'll go ahead and read it. How do you ensure that food donation organizations aren't counted twice? For example, if their capacity is reported by a food bank, their partner, and their own submitting their own survey.
Yeah, so this is also very important, and this is why it's that we mentioned you might want to first start with the food bank and get a sense of who they're partnering with. Or so you could have it where the food bank is wrapping up the reporting for all of their feeding agencies. If you do this, however, you know, again, you're not going to be capturing all of the food rescue activity in the jurisdiction. It's up to the jurisdictions and the counties to really take action to make sure that double counting is not occurring. So one way to do this would be, if you're going to the food bank, just say, we only want to know what the food bank recovered directly from food donors. This is a critical element that is in that survey template. We're not asking questions about what food did you receive from the food bank. We're asking questions about the food that you rescued directly from food donors. So that's a critical component of it. And we'd be happy to talk to you in more detail offline to go into that deeper. There's a lot that goes into it, but we have thought a lot about double counting and taken a lot of measures to ensure that that would not be occurring, at least when we are receiving reports from jurisdictions. So we can certainly provide some additional guidance and tips for how we think that jurisdictions could avoid that. And the survey has been developed specifically to try to avoid that. And I think that it does get at that, but that's also a great question. So Ray, we actually have to move on to the next session or the next section of the webinar. But thank you so much. And thank you for everyone that asked a question. Those were wonderful.
Great, thank you, Martine. This is Laura Moreno. If you could go to the next slide.
I'm just waiting for the slide to advance.
No problem. Well, thank you, Martine, for that great presentation. I will just start with the SB 1383 regulations require counties in coordination with jurisdictions and regional agencies located within the county to estimate the amount of edible food disposed by generators located in the jurisdiction and identify the amount of new or expanded capacity, if any, at food recovery organizations or food recovery services that is necessary to recover the edible food that is estimated to be disposed. As Martine previously discussed, they are also required to identify existing, proposed new, or expanded capacity at food recovery organizations and services that is or will be available to Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators. Prior to diving deeper, I will give a brief overview of the Excel calculator tool and the associated guidance document that was developed by CalRecycle to assist jurisdictions and counties estimate edible food disposed by commercial edible food generators and compare to existing capacity. And after I give the brief overview, Christopher Bria will also be screen sharing and providing more detailed information on the calculator, and I will later provide more detailed information on the guidance document. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, there are edible food recovery capacity planning requirements under 1383. The edible food recovery capacity planning calculator can assist in meeting these requirements by having two primary functions. The first one is estimating edible food disposed by Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators by generator type. The second is that the calculator tool has the capacity to record existing, new, or expanded capacity to estimate if additional capacity is needed to recover edible food disposed by Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators. The calculator can be used for one or both of these functions. If both functions are used, the calculator also estimates the difference between edible food estimated to be disposed and existing capacity for food recovery to estimate the needed capacity to recover all edible food disposed by generators. Next slide, please. As Martine previously mentioned, the calculator and the survey are designed to be complementary. Both the calculator and the survey have functions to help estimate existing, proposed new, and expanded capacity for edible food recovery organizations or services. However, as I said, the tools can be used together. The calculator is designed to help jurisdictions estimate the amount of edible food disposed by generators in the jurisdiction, while the survey is designed to help jurisdictions determine if they have sufficient edible food recovery capacity to recover the amount of edible food that is estimated to be disposed. Data collected as part of the survey can also be used to help populate the calculator to record estimated capacity for jurisdictions within the county. Next slide, please. As Martine said before and has previously showed this figure, in 2018, CalRecycle's waste characterization studies started sorting food waste into 8 categories based on edibility, recoverability, and type. And before we move forward, I want to take a step back to explain how CalRecycle is estimating edible food using this concept of potentially donatable as defined in CalRecycle's waste characterization study. I specifically want to make sure to make the connection between how we sort food in the waste characterization study and how the calculator has been set up. So as I mentioned, and the figure shows, previously we used to sort food waste into total food waste, and now we have split it up into multiple categories. First, we break food waste. We first delineate total food waste between edible food and inedible parts. Inedible parts is one category and includes things like banana peels or eggshells that are generally not eaten. Within edible food, the discarded food is characterized as being either potentially donatable or non-donatable based on whether it was likely that the food could have been safely recovered for human consumption prior to discard. Potentially donatable categories include items discarded whole or in a manner that would have made it potentially recoverable. So we use here items that were, discarded, for instance, in unopened original packaging. While non-donatable food categories include items that were partially eaten or discarded in open packages. So to give a clearer example here, a half-eaten burrito or something that had been previously cut into would be in that non-donatable category, and as it was unlikely to be recovered safely for human consumption prior to discard, while potentially donatable would be, for instance, say bags of shredded lettuce that were thrown away whole and were still in original unopened packaging. For the purposes of the calculator, edible food is considered food intended for human consumption that could be safely recovered, similar to potentially donatable food as defined in the waste characterization study. As Martine previously mentioned, the regulatory definition also specifies, however, that nothing in regulation requires or authorizes the recovery of food that does not meet the food safety standards in the California Retail Food Code. Next slide, please. The concept of the calculator is relatively straightforward, and the illustration on this slide uses supermarkets as an example in a theoretical jurisdiction. I will go through this example as a way to illustrate the functionality of the calculator. As a user of the calculator, in that first step, you would be required to input the number of supermarkets in your city, an example of a Tier 1 commercial edible food generator. Once you put that in, you would also, to get from number of supermarkets to estimate the amount of edible food disposed by those supermarkets in your city, the number of supermarkets is then multiplied by an estimated factor for average pounds of edible food disposed per supermarket per year, a step 3 user input. That is then again multiplied to get the amount of edible food disposed from supermarkets in your city in 2022 in this example. Regulations also require users to estimate edible food disposed at the end of the reporting period, in this example, 2024. To estimate this, the calculator requires users to input current and projected population numbers, and the projection for edible food disposed in the future year is estimated using that population projection. Next slide, please.
Apologies,
Next
it's
slide.
taking a moment for the slide to advance.
No worries. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the number of generators, as I said, is multiplied by a factor of pounds of edible food disposed per supermarket per year. At this time, users must provide these estimates, which is the topic of the associated guidance document that we will go over shortly. In the future, statewide factors will be provided to estimate the amount of edible food disposed by commercial edible food generator type. So we would, for instance, be providing a factor in the future of pounds per year of edible food disposed by supermarkets and other Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators. Data to determine such factors has not been previously collected by CalRecycle, and relatively limited data exists to establish such estimates. However, the upcoming waste characterization studies will be the source of these statewide factors. To give a little more clarity, due to COVID, the generator-based food waste characterization study will now be conducted in 2021 and early 2022. When that data is available, CalRecycle will update the calculator to provide those statewide factors as part of the tool. In the interim, as I mentioned, CalRecycle has provided a guidance document to help users of the calculator estimate their own factors by generator type, including references to existing data sources. I will go over the guidance document in more detail after Chris discusses the specifics of the calculator. Next slide. One additional function of the calculator is that it also can allow you to estimate edible food disposed by food type. Although not required by SB 1383, Step 4B of the calculator provides the optional function to split total edible food disposed into 5 different food types, as seen on the screen: vegetative, meat, eggs, dairy, and dairy alternatives, cooked, baked, or prepared perishable items, and packaged non-perishable items. This information may be helpful to jurisdictions in planning for supplemental food recovery infrastructure and capacity. This could include refrigerated vehicles, additional cold storage, kitchen space, or staffing. In order for the tool to estimate totals by food type, again, the calculator requires the user to provide information on the percentage of each food type within total edible food disposed. Users should confirm that these percentages sum up to 100 for each type of commercial edible food generator. And these food types that we provided here are based on the food types used in CalRecycle's 2018 and upcoming waste characterization studies. More information on estimations by food type can also be found in the associated guidance document that we will discuss. Next slide, please. The calculator can be used to record the details of existing, proposed new, and expanded food recovery capacity. The data can be collected through the survey as previously discussed or through another mechanism. This is designed for tracking capacity at the jurisdiction level, and it is recorded in pounds per month for each food recovery organization or services. The monthly amounts are then extrapolated to provide an annual estimate of existing capacity. As is similar to estimating the amount of edible food disposed, and that can be tracked or estimated by food type, users can optionally track capacity by food type as well, using the same food types as were used to estimate edible food disposal by Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators. Next slide, please. Another potential function of the calculator is estimating additional food recovery capacity that is needed by comparing the estimated amount of edible food disposed by Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators with the existing, new, or expanded capacity. If both of these sets of information are input into the calculator, it will automatically calculate the difference, which is whether there's sufficient capacity or not to capture the total amount of edible food estimated to be disposed by Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators. Next slide. Also, as Martine previously mentioned in the disclaimer, these guidance documents and tools were developed by CalRecycle as a courtesy for informational and example purposes only. Use of these tools is optional and is not a regulatory requirement. Additionally, other stakeholders have created tools for this purpose or that could potentially be used, and we just wanted to highlight a couple here. For example, County of San Diego created a calculator, which we have provided a link for here, and the Natural Resources Defense Council also has a calculator for baselining food waste generation and food rescue potential. Next slide. At this time, I will turn it over to Chris Bria, who will screen share the calculator and provide a more detailed overview of the calculator that I just provided a high-level description for. Chris, handing it over to you.
Hello, everyone. So my presentation is going to be to do a quick demo on the calculator and point out the basic functions and how it works and what it will do for you if you use it. So the calculator can be found on the capacity planning for food recovery page, down here under estimating food disposed by mandated food donors. I'm not going to go through the whole navigation to get there because it is a little bit deep on the page, but once you're here, it is listed there with the other tools. The calculator consists of 5 basic tabs. The first tab is a README that goes over some of the general background, the structure for reporting, the disclaimer, and basic instructions on how each step works, links to other information, and a basic overview of what happens on each step or each tab and each step as you move through the calculator. The next tab is a definitions tab that shows definitions for words used in the calculator and mostly pulls from the regulations and or the waste characterization study. So if you're working through the calculator and trying to find out, like, what does that word mean, it will be on this tab. The next tab is where the edible food calculations actually start. So just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to zoom out a little bit just so you can see the full scope of the information on this tab and where the calculations happen. So I'm going to zoom back in and show the basic functionality of this tab. The first piece of data entry, you would put your city's name and based on the reporting period you're working on, which is referenced in the README right here on line 10, that the first reporting period would cover, or the first planning period to be reported would cover a 3-year period from January 22nd, January 1st, 2022 to December 31st, 2024. So I'm going to put 2022 and 2024 here. The next place for data entry would be inputting your population in the current year or the year you're planning for. So for demonstration purposes, I'm going to put in the current population of City A is 10,000, and the population in 3 years will be 10,100, which produces a change in population of 1%. This comes in as part of the calculations for showing a projected growth in future years, because the planning period is for not necessarily planning for right now, but planning for what you will need at the end of the first period covered. The next steps that you input are the average amount of food based on generator type. And this is part of what Laura was discussing in her guidance document. Just for demonstration purposes, I am going to just say every type of facility makes 1,000 pounds a year. And this is where I was asked to specifically note that when you're working in your generator types, there is a difference between large venues and large events. And this is a good distinction to make. And I'm going to switch back to the definitions tab, that a venue is a generator that is a permanent venue that may have multiple events at it. So the example we've heard before is the Hollywood Bowl. That would be one venue to use. You wouldn't necessarily try to count every single concert or event that happens at the Hollywood Bowl. Same thing with the stadium. Let's say you have Dodger Stadium in LA. That's the venue. You're not going to try to count the individual number of games that would happen there or the number of concerts that would happen there. You're really just going to look at what the venue itself would produce. So that is a distinction between events and venues. Events may be more at a non-permanent venue site or happen more sporadically. So back to the calculations page. The next step that you can fill in is, now that we've established, and I'm going to use supermarkets again as an example to echo Laura's presentation. So now that we know that a supermarket makes 1,000 pounds a year by facility, and that number carries down right here. In this city, we're going to say that there are 10 supermarkets, which will then calculate that 10 times 1,000 means it's currently producing 10,000 tons per year. Based on the future growth, as you move through to the far right, it'll tell you right now it's 10,000, based on the future growth, and it will be 10,100. The next piece over here on the right is, if you want to go to this level to try to calculate the exact amount and type of food you're going to have, this is where, these are optional calculations. The rest of the calculator would still function without filling this part in. But this is so you can actually estimate the different types of edible food that could be recovered at different types of generators. Because a supermarket may have a different level of food of each food type than a large venue would, and different than a food distributor would. So this actually is helpful for capacity planning purposes, because different organizations may have the ability to collect a different amount of each food type. Certain things might require refrigeration, other things might not. Maybe you have a smaller pantry that's only open, a couple times a month, and they'll be fine with the packaged non-perishable stuff, but maybe they can't really handle a whole lot of meat or dairy. So if you are doing these calculations, you can put in that amount, and it will tell you the amount currently produced based on these numbers, and the amount that would be produced in the future based on population growth. I intentionally did not put these numbers incorrect to show you that right here, it's indicating that, hey, you want to make sure that this number right here is adding up to 100%. Otherwise, your estimates by type may be off. And you can do that for each generator type as you proceed through the calculator and fill that in. I'm not going to go over every single piece because I'm just trying to demonstrate how the general calculations work. And when you get down to the bottom, it will show you some totals for not only the overall food by generator, but if you add it up by type, it will also show that here. And right below that, if you try to calculate by food type, there will be a subtable down here showing the totals by food type. The next tab, and once again, I'm going to scroll out a little bit to show the scope on this, so you can see that there will be a little bit more than you will generally see unless if you are zoomed in as I am. So you will get a little bit of a summary of the calculations you did on the previous page. I think this is a good time to offer a mea culpa, saying that someone was kind enough to point out that in the production version that we have on our webpage, this future projection number is actually pulling from the wrong cell. It is marked as H137 instead of G137. And so we will be updating a new version of this Excel calculator to redirect where that cell is pulling its data from. It doesn't affect anything else. It is only on just this little summary box right here. So the next steps are where you might start listing information about the edible food organizations that you currently have available. So I am, for the sake of not trying to type all this in, I'm just going to paste the values from up above. And this is just a way to, there's some basic information on here. This is not necessarily what would have to be kept in the implementation record. This is just a way that you can kind of see it all in one place and say, these are the organizations we are going to use, and this is how much they've said they can accept from us monthly. If you want to do the additional calculations for food by type, if you move further to the right, what you will find is another bit of a table where you can write whether they accept a food type and how much of it they may be able to accept from you each month. Once again, this is an optional step. This is if you want to go to that level of granularity to figure out what's available, you can. But the main functions of this tab for determining your available capacity is over here on the left side. So in this top box, this is where you would put your existing food recovery organizations. And there's room for quite a few. When you get a little bit farther down, this is where you can also list new organizations you may be using. And for sake of speed, I am going to just copy the info I had at the top so you don't have to watch me struggle through typing all that in. So in this case, we've established that we have 1,000 pounds per month of existing capacity, which would be 12,000 pounds a year. And we're going to have an expanded capacity at Gilligan's Food Pantry for another 100 pounds per month. And then that totals down here at the bottom. The last tab is a summary tab that will then look at the other calculations that have been made so far and summarize it for both the current year you're working with and your future projection year. And this will tell you what your current, what your projected food totals would be and how much space you have available and whether you have a shortfall capacity or more than enough capacity. And the last and final table down here is once again related to putting in the amount or trying to calculate the type of different food that would be available by each generator And if you went the extra step on the capacity details tab to actually try to list how much of each type of food you may have be able to have accepted at your local food recovery organizations. So with that, I believe I am wrapped up, and our next stop will be questions.
Okay. Sorry, just trying to unmute myself. Thank you. As a reminder for the Q&A session, please follow the instructions on the slide. We will be calling and unmuting you on our end. Please then go ahead and unmute yourself, state your affiliation, and then you can ask your question. We'll start with a question that came into the SLCP inbox from Monica White regarding which generators are included in the calculator. So you are now unmuted on our end. Please state your affiliation and then you can ask your question.
Monica White from Edgar and Associates. So I do have a question. If the intention is for us to have all of the tier 1 and tier 2 generators implemented like in the Excel sheet, or are we only doing tier 1 or tier 2 generators that we know do not have current programs? Does that make sense?
Well, Chris, maybe I can start. The requirement, the regulatory, this is Martine, by the way.
There's a reason I wasn't saying anything. Thank you.
The regulatory requirement is to estimate the amount of food or the amount of edible food disposed by tier 1 and tier 2 generators. So that's all of them. That's all the tier 1 and tier 2 commercial edible food generators that you've identified are subject to these requirements. You would be providing an estimate of the amount of edible food that they collectively are disposing of. So that would even include your generators like supermarkets, where many of them are already participating in food donation. Because the data that the input data that we have for this tool oftentimes encompasses it accounts for food that's being donated, because really this is just looking at disposal. So that's in the data, if that makes sense. And maybe, I don't know if Laura even has something to add about some of that data that we're just looking at disposal, that you know, if a supermarket is donating food, they just have a lower rate of disposal.
So
Definitely. So
it's if I could just, so you're saying that CalRecycle intentionally chose between the NICS codes and the NRDC disposal factors, there are some baseline levels of food recovery built in within those disposal factors. Therefore, if we're including a mix of, say, grocery stores where some are participating in food recovery and some are not, because that's where it gets a little confusing, is that we're just using one factor for all of them, and say we have 10 grocery stores and 8 are donating with edible food and 2 are not. It all looks like they're all going to have the same level of disposal.
So Monica, correct in that to answer your question, the factors input into the calculator represent an average across all of those tier 1 or tier 2 generator types. And whether, as Martine mentioned, you know, the CalRecycle data that we provide in the guidance document that I will go over is only for disposal and was collected from facilities that, some facilities that did have food recovery programs already. However, we're not, the data doesn't show the extent to which that happens. The NRDC data is different, and there are details in the guidance document that allow the users to actually create factors themselves. So if you believe that your facilities have a much higher food recovery or have better food recovery programs, say, than the statewide average, you could alter your factor to account for that. And this is going a little bit into the details of the next section, so I don't want to confuse people, but I'm also able to chat with you offline for more detailed information.
Okay, perfect.
And this is Chris, the one thing I would add to that is going back to what Kara said earlier, that this is a planning tool. It's not necessarily going to be exact, but the idea is to give you something to work with, something to be able to estimate based on, I guess you could call them these sort of ballpark numbers, because we're not going into exactly, well, this supermarket has this exact type of output and this other supermarket has a totally different type. You're really just trying to get an idea of what you will need to plan for longer term. It's not meant to be exact to the micro pound or anything.
So that's, I mean, because that really gets to the crux of kind of what my intention is with the questions is, so say we go through this exercise and we create a disposal number for tier 1 and tier 2, and we do our surveys and we identify where there could be needed capacity to expand edible food recovery, and then we start doing the work and those things change. As long as we're giving kind of those kinds of boundaries around a program, a jurisdiction can be within the compliance requirements of 1383, right? If we're showing we're auditing everyone, we know that all the grocery stores are participating, we're creating investment programs with food recovery. Our numbers could be way off in reality compared to what we're putting in the calculator, but we're still moving in the right direction because our intentions are there and our box checking is there for 1383, right?
So the accuracy of what you report is not what you won't be penalized if it is not 100% accurate. What we're looking for is that you completed the requirements in accordance with what was in the regulations. So some of this, and even in the survey, you'll see that we included notes asking the respondent for their best guess data if they don't have that information. So it really goes back to the fact that this is a planning exercise, and you need to take the necessary steps to get the best data possible, but it's very likely that some of that might not be as accurate. And as time goes on, as the years go on, and you become more familiar with this and the organizations become more familiar with this that you're working with, the data most likely will become more refined. So that's what's important. We will not penalize you if it is inaccurate, but we will penalize you if you do not complete the requirements as they're laid out in the regulations.
Okay, perfect.
And then the one thing I could add to that is, as I showed in the calculator, when you're estimating the disposal, the real way to make the calculator work is say we have X number of supermarkets and a supermarket on average makes this much per month. You can do the optional extra steps of trying to break it down by food type so you can do more accurate planning, but it's not necessarily going to be 100% true. You're really just trying to get an idea of what you need to plan for, because there will be different outputs at different generators and you'll have different recovery organizations that can handle different amounts of food depending on their refrigeration capabilities, for example.
Okay, and then to Kara's point, as long as for the capacity assessment, as long as we have some level of tonnage numbers, disposal numbers from tier 1 and tier 2, and capacity numbers for food recovery agencies, those are two of the important numerical pieces of information you guys need, whether we use the calculator or other kind of best guess estimates depending on the jurisdiction.
Absolutely, because with that numerical information, you can then quantify if there is, if there is a lack of capacity, essentially. You can take the total pounds and then say, this is what we have the ability to recover each year in pounds, and this is what our capacity is in pounds. So by comparing those, you can see if there's a need for additional capacity. So that was a long answer, but the answer is yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica.
Okay, next question is from Julia DeVore. Julia, you are now unmuted on our end. Please state your affiliation and go ahead and restate your question regarding potentially donatable food and estimating tonnages by generator category.
Hi. I think it was kind of addressed in the last answer to Monica. Our concern was when we have generators or a robust program already in the jurisdiction where nearly all of the grocery stores and distributors have programs in place and report donating 100% of what they have edible. If we were to put an average in their numbers, we're going to have a much higher goal than is feasible to reach. But as you mentioned, we can reassess that number based on the fact that we know they have a strong program, and that if we don't reach that goal, but we are checking in with donors each year and trying to help them maximize, then the jurisdiction will be protected and covered. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, and so this is Martine. Something else that I think is really important is that in our 2018 waste characterization study, we sorted at the generator level at supermarkets. In my outreach with the California Grocers Association and many individual supermarkets, we know that the vast majority of them, to some degree, are participating in food donation. And that was no exception for the supermarkets that we surveyed as part of the waste characterization study. So since we're only looking at disposal, as I mentioned before, that would be reflected in them having a lower rate of disposal. And then in the data in the calculator, that input data, we're looking at an average for what supermarkets are disposing of. So it is accounted for to some degree in the calculator and in that data. That's just important to be aware of. But just like you said, if you want to add more granular information, you absolutely can do that.
Well, and I think that goes back to the importance of really working closely with these donors to ensure that they are maximizing, because they may report 100%, but we can help walk through and evaluate their program with them and ensure that they're actually more excess that could be donated, and we'll help you through that process.
Oh, absolutely. And that's such a great point. I wasn't going to say anything, but if a supermarket says they're donating 100% of their edible food that would otherwise be disposed, I would say that's phenomenal. But that is what we are hearing from food recovery organizations and services throughout the state. So that, just like you said, that'd be something where you could say, that's fantastic. Can you walk me through that so we can better understand the types of food you're donating and the amounts? So excellent point that you added, and thank you for mentioning it.
Thank you.
Okay, and the next question that we have is coming from Clifton Chu. I will go ahead and unmute you. If you could unmute yourself, state your affiliation, and then go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, this is Clifton Chu with the County of Santa Clara. My just question was, does the report have to be from each jurisdiction, or can we report as the county as a whole? Because otherwise we report for each and every jurisdiction within the county as well as the county itself.
Yeah, so the county is going to be coordinating the capacity planning efforts. But with that said, each jurisdiction is responsible for assessing the capacity in their jurisdiction and then reporting that information back to the county. The county is then collecting the data from all the jurisdictions, aggregating that data, and then reporting it back to CalRecycle. In addition, if one of the jurisdictions that reports to the county identifies that they do not have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that's estimated to be disposed by the Tier 1 and Tier 2 generators, then the county then needs to notify that jurisdiction that lacks capacity, because they're going to be required, that jurisdiction that lacks capacity will be required to submit an implementation schedule to CalRecycle that specifically includes timelines and milestones for how they're going to plan to increase capacity to fill that gap. So we're kind of going deep into the regulations there, but I did cover that at the beginning of the presentation. So all of the content that we publish on our website needs to meet accessibility ADA compliance. Once we run the accessibility check on this PowerPoint, we will be posting the slides. So I encourage you to take a closer look at those. Also, just for anybody that's on this call, for your reference, the edible food recovery capacity planning requirements can be found in the regulations in section 18992.2. So that's just an important thing to just take a look at. Did I answer the question?
Yes, well, I also kind of have a slide follow-up in that the recovery organizations will cover more than one jurisdiction. How does that work?
Yeah, so I would take a closer look at the survey, the Edible Food Recovery Capacity Planning Survey, because we definitely account for that, that just like you said, some food recovery organizations operate in the entire county. Some of them span multiple counties, and some, like Food Forward, for example, they're one of the largest produce recovery organizations in California. They can span regions, the entire Southern California region, in terms of their reach of the amount of food that they're rescuing, or where they're rescuing the food and where they're distributing the food. So it's a very good point. The survey has customizable or jurisdiction-specific questions that are really asking things like, how many or what percentage of the food that you rescue was rescued in city X, for example. So there, again, this is a lot of detail, but in that survey, we ask questions about what's the total pounds of food that you recovered in 2020, for example. And you could change that. You could change that to 2019 if you felt that 2020 was not a representative year. It's customizable. So it's really at the discretion of the jurisdiction to see what would be most accurate. So you could say, how many pounds did you recover in 2020? In what cities do you recover edible food directly from food donors? So that's where they would indicate what cities they're operating in. And then in that jurisdiction specific question, you would list each of the cities where they say they're rescuing food, and they would indicate in this city, 10% of the food that or 10% of our total rescue is coming from donors in this city. So again, that's really trying to get at how much of the rescue is, how many pounds of food rescue capacity is verifiably available to the generators in that specific jurisdiction. So it's very detailed what I'm getting into. If you do have more questions, we'd be happy to answer them offline. But again, I just really encourage you to take a close look at the survey document.
Hey, Martine, I just wanted to add one other point to that. And Cliff, I think also there are some counties that are doing their edible food capacity planning on a countywide basis. And so another approach would be for all of the jurisdictions to collaborate and quantify, how much is available. And as they identify their tier 1 and tier 2 generators and estimate, how much is needed, you could put it kind of all together, because as Martine says, to be able to parse out what's available to any particular jurisdiction could be challenging. So that's an alternative approach. The key to that is that, each individual jurisdiction is still going to be responsible for ensuring that there's access to capacity for their tier 1 and tier 2 commercial edible food or food donors. And so, there's a balancing act there, but you certainly, in particular your county and the way your county is going about capacity planning, you could take that optional approach. Did that help answer the question?
You actually got it. That is exactly what we're doing. So that's why I was kind of curious if we had to go back and do individual ones as well.
No, your approach will be just fine. The key is when it gets to determining if there's a gap in capacity, I think that's where the challenge is going to come into play, is trying to equitably, determine how all those jurisdictions are going to contribute to building that additional capacity. But I'm confident if there's any county that can figure that out, it's your county.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Gertie Grutenhaus. You are now unmuted. Please state your name and affiliation and go ahead and restate your question.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, this is Gertrude Grutenhaus with the San Diego Food System Alliance. So my question is related to the fact that jurisdictions might receive kind of low response rates for these surveys. Just as an example, one of the most recent kind of nonprofit surveys that we did in our region, where we didn't offer incentives like gift cards had about a 35% response rate. So I'm curious to hear CalRecycle's guidance or advice for a situation where there is a lower response rate, say around 35%. How would that jurisdiction go about filling out the edible food capacity tab within the calculator?
Thanks, Gertrude. This is Martine. So I think it's critical if you're experiencing that low response rate that you emphasize that there is a regulatory requirement that entities that are contacted by the jurisdiction, they need to respond within, I believe it's 60 days. So that includes food recovery organizations and food recovery services. So if you are experiencing issues, I think that's something that we could talk more about offline, but it goes back to the messaging about this survey. So it's not just that we're the jurisdiction or, you know, the third party that's trying to get information for the jurisdiction from this recovery organization because we need to plan for capacity. It's more that this is a big opportunity for this organization to share information about what their current needs are, what do they need most to be able to continue their operations and expand capacity. So with that said, that's easy said, and it can be more difficult to actually accomplish, but they are subject to a regulatory requirement to respond. I don't know, Kara, if you have anything to add to that.
This is Jeff McDaniel with LAMD. I would just want to recommend that you reach out to your LAMD representatives that are in your area. There's a lot of information within our department that we can help provide you in guidance specific to getting better responses.
Martine, I didn't have anything else to add.
Awesome, thank you. Just a quick follow-up. You know, in the case that there isn't going to be like a 100% response rate, kind of going back to Monica's question too, if a jurisdiction can use maybe some of that more qualitative data and or kind of through conversations with agencies to try to estimate, you know, what that gap in response might be, and can kind of back up the way that they do that, would that be kind of an acceptable way to, you know, in the case that all other measures fail, to be able to come up with some sort of estimates?
I would say the answer is yes, because what you're describing is you've collected enough data and qualitative information to have a defensible estimate, and that's really what we would be looking for. Is you know, did they meet the requirements as they're laid out in the regulations? Is this a defensible? Is there the way that they went about estimating capacity defensible? And what you described does sound that it could potentially be that. Of course, we won't know for sure until we see it, but just based on my knowledge of San Diego Food System Alliance, work that you do individually, and that organization, I think that it would most likely be okay. But again, we won't know for sure until we see the report.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gertrude.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any more calculator specific questions, so we're going to go back to the questions that we did not get to answer during the first session, and we're going to call on Caitlin Haberlin, who had a question regarding the survey. You are now unmuted on our end. Please unmute yourself, state your affiliation, and then you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there, my name is Caitlin. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, so I actually asked my question for an earlier section and it was answered. My question was that our jurisdiction sent out a survey in partnership with another organization, and we found it difficult for groups to answer how much capacity they have, but they might know how many meals they serve. And my question was, could we calculate capacity from a number like that if we took the average pounds per meal? And meal was just an example. I was also thinking that we could calculate it from maybe like a dollar amount and equating $1 per pound of food.
Sure. So let me ask a follow-up question. If they know the meals that they serve, then Do they know the pounds that they're recovering? Do they have that metric?
The organization that I'm thinking of as an example doesn't have any scales, but they might be able to count how many meals because they are serving individuals that live at their organization.
Okay, so that's really helpful. Yeah, so meals is great because the standard that is used is that one meal is equal to 1.2 pounds. So if they know the meals that they're serving per year, you could estimate, and I would say defensively estimate, the amount of the pounds that they're recovering per year as well. And then from there, you would know for that organization, this is what we have in terms of the best data on them for their capacity. So you'd really do that conversion from meals to pounds and then add that to your data on the other organizations in your area. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And my only other follow-up to that is if we found another defensible way to qualify quantity, is that something that we should run by your team, or should we just kind of explain our answers in our reporting?
Well, you know, I would say to that, working with CalRecycle and sharing information, for us, it would be more of a learning opportunity. We're always interested in learning more about what jurisdictions are doing to come up with their estimates. So it's a great opportunity. I don't think that you would have to do that. As long as it's defensible, you could include it in your reporting, but certainly we are interested in hearing what others are doing because that's also an opportunity for us not only to learn, but then to share that with others across the state. So we can follow up with you offline if that's something you'd be interested in, but no pressure.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for another question from a previous section. So Christina Hansen, you asked a question about organization and services being able to estimate additional meals. You are now unmuted. Please state your name, affiliation, and restate your question. I'll go ahead and read it then. Possibly organization and services could be able to estimate in terms of how many additional meals they could or could not accommodate, and then there could be a conversion factor to convert meals to pounds and to tons.
Yeah, so she's exactly right. That's what I was just mentioning, is that there is a standard meals to pounds conversion factor that is used, that is widely used, and that is that one meal is equal to 1.2 pounds. So that's one way. If the smaller food pantry, for example, or other food recovery organization doesn't know their pounds that they're recovering, but they know the meals, that you could do that conversion, and that is a defensible conversion.
Okay, the next question that we have came from Cassie Bartholomew. No, there were a few questions. This was regarding regarding the Sorry, Cassie, you are now unmuted. If you could unmute yourself and then ask your question.
Sure. Hi, Casey Bartholomew from Stop Waste. Hi, Martine. Sorry, I just hit disregard my last question, which wasn't framed as a question, but I think you answered earlier, maybe during Clifton's question around capacity planning. We are taking a countywide capacity planning approach. And I was just listening, Martine, to your comments earlier around the jurisdictions being required to submit an implementation plan for their individual jurisdiction if gaps are revealed during the capacity planning process or if they don't respond. And I just know in Alameda County, as others have shared, we don't see food recovery happening within the jurisdiction boundaries. Much of the food comes from, other jurisdictions into jurisdictions that have higher rates of food insecurity and higher number of food recovery organizations and services. So I think a countywide approach to both the capacity planning and the implementation plan makes a lot of sense. Also, just from the funding perspective of not putting the funding burden on the cities that are typically the ones that have the highest rates of food insecurity, which is kind of how it's framed right now, as some cities with less food insecurity are pushing more food into other cities. So I think my question was answered because I heard we could do a countywide approach to both of those capacity planning requirements.
Hi, Casey, and thank you so much for those comments. You're right, and I apologize for all of our attendees. Sometimes I am just verbatim saying the regulations. I have a lot of them memorized. So for that, really, the guidance that Kara provided is 100% acceptable. And maybe Kara, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Martine, and thanks, Cassie. I think, again, as I was sharing with Clifton, the important, and I think the most challenging part about the implementation schedule is clearly articulating what each jurisdiction is going to be doing in the way of contributing if there's a gap in infrastructure, how they are individually contributing to that. And, I think there's probably going to be a lot of creative ways to this. Like you said, it may be a dollar amount per number of tier 1 and tier 2 generators that you may do it on population. Whatever that is, what's going to be important is that each jurisdiction needs to, and likely you'll have to submit that by each jurisdiction. I'm not sure what might have to deal with that. But ultimately, each individual jurisdiction is responsible for ensuring that there's adequate capacity. So Cassie, I just think you guys, will need to be, and you're probably already thinking about how you're going to deal with it if additional capacity needs to be funded, what that will look like, and then each jurisdiction acknowledging their commitment to that implementation schedule. Does that help, Cassie?
Yeah, I think that helps. I guess just one other question, because Martine, you did share that there's a question about where the food comes from. And in the survey, there's an opportunity to say that, let's say a food recovery organization located in Oakland is receiving food from Palo Alto, which is not even in our county. So in the implementation plan, is there an opportunity to show that our capacity is being displaced by jurisdictions outside of our county? I guess I'm just wondering where we kind of capture, because that's a reality on the ground.
Yeah. Martine, I'll start and then you can jump in. It's a really good point. Unless you have some overriding, some way to prevent that, which I don't think there is a way, you can acknowledge it. Regardless of that, each jurisdiction is still responsible for expanding the capacity that's necessary for their tier 1 and tier 2. So, if a food donor has access to that capacity, it's not located in the county, there's nothing that prevents that. You still have to make up that gap. So does that help, Cassie?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Martina, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add, but Cassie, thanks so much.
Yes, thank you so much for your questions. I don't have anything to add, but we do need to move on to the next section. So I am going to turn it over to Laura.
Awesome. Thank you, Martine, and thanks to Chris and the CalRecycle team for the great info so far. Also for the great questions from all of the attendees. I am taking it home with the presenting on the last section before we have further Q&A. So now I will go over the guidance document associated with the calculator that is designed to help users identify estimates for the amount of edible food disposed on average by commercial edible food generators, and this is by type. So as we've talked about before, an average for instance, supermarkets as one tier 1 generator example. This is a required input by users of the calculator as part of step 3. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, statewide factors to estimate edible food disposed by tier 1 and tier 2 commercial edible food generators are not yet available. Thus, The primary purpose of this guidance document is to help users of the calculator select and alter factors to use in that calculator. As Chris mentioned, users of the calculator will input a factor of average pounds of edible food disposed to landfill per facility per year for each Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generator type, except for large events, which require an input of average pounds of edible food disposed to landfill per event. Next slide. In order to help users of the calculator identify factors that are most appropriate for their capacity planning purposes, the guidance document is split into 4 main sections, as screenshots shown on the slide. The first section is a section providing information on the data requirements of the calculator and providing some background on how to use the calculator. The second section is how to select edible food disposal conversion factors from existing sources, including how to convert external sources of data, such as the NRDC data, to units required for the calculator. The third section provides more information and data related to the optional function of estimating how much, or basically delineating estimates for total edible food disposed by food type. And then the final section is a section that has the relevant data tables and includes information on limitations of that data so that as you are looking at it, you can use the data that makes most sense for your capacity planning requirements and given the different characteristics of your jurisdiction or county. Next slide. There are 2 main data sources included in this document, some from CalRecycle and then some from the Natural Resources Defense Council. The first set of data sources are from the 2018 CalRecycle waste characterization studies. We have specific data available from a small generator-based sub-study where we sampled a small number of industry groups, including supermarkets, grocery stores, food distributors, wholesale food vendors, and restaurants. This was a very small sample size. However, we were able to collect data on the pounds of potentially donatable food waste disposed per facility per year, which are the units used in the calculator. And I'll go over this a little bit more on the next slide. In addition to this CalRecycle data, the guidance document also includes information from 2 NRDC reports. One on estimating quantities and types of food waste at the city level, and the other is modeling the potential to increase food rescue. I will go over this in a bit more detail, as I said, in the following slides, and there is even more detail in the report in the guidance document. Other sources of data estimating the amount of food waste disposed by industry group may also be available, so from other sources other than CalRecycle and NRDC. Users of the tool do not have to use the data sources provided in this guidance document, but one important thing to note is that if you do use non-CalRecycle data sources, ensure they are in the proper units to be used in the calculator, otherwise your estimates will likely be very inaccurate. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, there do not yet exist a comprehensive list of statewide factors estimating edible food disposed by each type of commercial edible food generator. However, data sets do exist that can help estimate these factors. When selecting factors, users should consider the limitations of the data and assumptions made to choose estimates that best reflect their situation. As previously mentioned, other tools exist that can also be used for capacity planning purposes. To go a little bit more into the details of the data, the 2018 waste characterization study data, as I mentioned, provides estimates for a limited number of industry groups derived from small sample sizes. And to repeat those again, those industry groups are supermarkets and grocery stores, food distributors, wholesale food vendors, and restaurants. However, one of the key benefits of the 2018 CalRecycle data is that it is already in the units needed for the calculator. Additionally, the definition of edible food also aligns with the definition in 1383, as we previously described, with potentially donatable food being the definitions used in the waste characterization study. The main challenge when using external data, which is relevant to both NRDC data included in the guidance document, as well as other potential external data, is that these estimates may include materials or businesses that are not targeted. Give an example. Factors for grocers may include grocers that do not meet the threshold to be considered a Tier 1 commercial edible food generator. They could be smaller grocers. Additionally, most estimates are for total food waste or do not delineate between the edible portion and other inedible parts. Finally, many estimates may include more than just landfill disposal, while 1383 focuses on landfill disposal specifically. The second challenge, as I mentioned before, is that estimates are generally not provided in the appropriate units for the calculator. For example, some of the NRDC data provided in the guidance document is provided in the units of pounds per employee per year, whereas the calculator needs a per facility per year basis. Next slide. As I mentioned, the main purpose of the guidance document is to provide users of the calculator with information to estimate a factor for edible food disposed to landfill by generator type. The document provides multiple potential sources of data and information on how to convert that data to the appropriate units for the calculator. To make this more understandable, I will go through an example. The goal of this is to estimate a factor for pounds of edible food disposed per average supermarket per year. Option 1 is to use 2018 CalRecycle waste characterization data, which provides an estimate of 9,300 pounds of potentially donatable food disposed per facility per year. Next slide. Another option is to use a factor for supermarkets from NRDC. The NRDC report estimates that approximately 3,000 pounds of food waste is generated per supermarket employee per year. To convert to the needed units, we first multiply by the average number of supermarket employees per facility to get a pounds of food waste generation per facility estimate. For this example, we use a statewide data from California's Employment Development Department. This data is also provided at the county level. To convert food waste from food waste generation to food waste disposed, we estimate that 50% is disposed given a robust organics collection system in our hypothetical jurisdiction. To convert from total food waste disposed to edible food waste disposed, we then multiply by a conversion factor estimating 22% of total food waste disposed was edible, and that is derived from the 2018 waste characterization study. Major limitations of this estimate are that supermarkets and grocery stores are one industry group despite being separated in SB 1383 as different Tier 1 commercial edible food generator types. Next slide. So in summary, we estimate this factor two ways: the factor of pounds of edible food disposed per average supermarket per year. Using waste characterization data, it's about 9,300 pounds of edible food disposed per supermarket per year. And using NRDC data, we estimate 12,870 pounds of edible food disposed per supermarket per year. These estimates are relatively close, but it is up to the user to determine which one is the most appropriate for their purposes. Next slide. Finally, as previously mentioned, CalRecycle is in the process of conducting waste characterization study to collect data to establish statewide factors that can be used for the calculator. Our contractor, Tetra Tech, is beginning to recruit businesses and organizations in selected industry groups to participate in the study. If you know of any generators that might be interested in participating, please email us at wastechar@calrecycle.ca.gov. What do participating businesses and organizations have to do? Well, they'll have to fill out a survey on their food waste management practices and allow the field team to take a minimum of a 200-pound sample from both their trash and organics bin, as well as do a visual assessment of their recycling bin. The team will also be sorting into 11 material categories, 8 food categories, and 3 non-food categories. Participating sites will receive a composition report of what was in their trash and organic samples. Some of the industry groups we expect to be more difficult to recruit are listed above, And if you have any recommendations on businesses or organizations in these groups that may be interested in participating and getting a composition report of their organics and trash bin, please let us know. And again, email us at wastechar@calrecycle.ca.gov. And with that, we can start taking any questions on the guidance document.
Thank you. As a reminder, please go ahead and state your affiliation once we call on you for your questions, and unmute yourself and follow the instructions on the screen. The first question we will go to is from the SLCP inbox from Monica White regarding a size threshold for distribution companies that are registered with the California Department of Public Health. Monica, you are unmuted. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and restate your affiliation.
Monica White from Edgar & Associates. Yes, thank you for clarifying that. So we were curious with the distribution companies that hold those registrations. We understand that there's a very large range of sizes with them. And it was an original interpretation that even small operators that are registered as food distributors would be included under the tier 1 or 2 thresholds. But I wasn't sure if there was some specific flexibility jurisdictions could exercise to remove ones that were smaller. Do you have any feedback on that?
Yeah, hi Monica, this is Martine. I would say that the flexibility is really in that definition of food distributor. So if they meet the definition, or if they have that they're registered as a food distributor and they are meeting that definition, they are subject to the requirements. With that said, though, if they don't have any surplus edible food to donate, so maybe if this is, I'm thinking more of a food manufacturer where sometimes they don't have types of food that are really able to be recovered, that would be different. But it's really if they meet that definition, there is no size that is specified. There's no threshold. So it's all of them that would be in. That said, some of them really will not have any edible food that is available.
Okay, so if it's like a person that's manufacturing small scale and distributing cupcakes or out of the, and they were registered as a food distributor, there would still have to be document tracking that they were checked in with, but there's no excess edible food and therefore they don't have to comply. I see Karish nodding her head, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead,
Kara.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we need to be a little bit careful in our assumptions, right? And I think to the degree that you document a reasonable assumption that you made and have it in your record, should CalRecycle question your estimate, that would probably be the way to handle it. But I think to Martine's point, we do want to be careful about suggesting that a certain size food distributor would not be included, small or large, right? And so, Monica, we're kind of walking a fine line there and want to be careful. But certainly, if you had a reasonable explanation and had that in your documentation, certainly CalRecycle would take that into consideration. But in general, all food distributors, regardless of size, wholesale food vendors, food service providers, should be included.
Okay, that's helpful. And I think what we're seeing for a lot of the very large ones is they may not have, say, routine recovery programs, but there could be like 1 or 2 instances where orders change and maybe they would be, we would encourage them, their first stop is to look for donation options when possible. So that type of tracking would be compliant with the intention of what you guys are looking for. To not necessarily have routine donation, but they would be included in a recovery program if they had the availability of edible food that could be sent on occasion if orders changed or things like that.
Yeah, I'll let Martine dive in, but I think, first and foremost, that food donor does have to have an agreement. Now, that agreement might state that, it's food when such and such happens. But it would be important that that food donor has the agreement, has those records, and when they do donate, has those donation records kept on site as well. Martine, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that covered everything. Thank you, Kara.
That's very
And
helpful.
thank you for the questions, Monica.
Okay, the next question I think is some follow-up to the question that was just asked by Monica, and it's coming from Vicki Jones. If you could state your affiliation, go ahead, unmute yourself, and then ask your question. Vicki, it looks like you're self-muted, but the question is saying, are pharmacies such as CVS included?
Pharmacies are not included as commercial edible food generators. So that's the pharmacy portion of that. They are not subject to these requirements.
Okay, thank you. This is actually Shannon Workington from Merced County. I guess I'm showing up as Vicki for some reason. She's my director. That was my question, so I appreciate that. I just wanted to clarify because I'm working on our lists right now, and
Sure, and thank you for that. And I think, you know, if you're looking at the supermarket definition or the grocery store definition, the key thing to consider is like really paying close attention to the language. So, for example, in the grocery store definition, you would see that it says it's a store that sells, certain line item or certain line of fresh grocery items, things like that. But the key in that definition is that it says that this store is primarily engaged in selling these items, and it's a line of dry grocery items, something like that. I don't know the exact language. I don't have it in front of me right now. But a CVS, for example, the primary purpose of a CVS is not selling groceries. So they would not meet that definition. So really just paying attention to the detail in the definition, I think will be the most helpful. And so right now we do have a couple more slides and we want to get through those, and then there'll be another opportunity to ask more questions. But for right now, I'm just going to turn it over to Laura briefly, and then we can answer the rest of the questions that come in.
Great, thanks, Martine.
You're welcome, and I'm sorry that the slides, for some reason, it takes them a moment to. It's going to take me a moment.
No worries at all. I can say this without a slide. We really want to say a special thank you to everyone that contributed to the creation and review of these tools and guidance document. And as Martine had mentioned previously, we are also at CalRecycle taking this as a learning opportunity to understand what you guys are doing. So if you have any feedback, please let us know. Next slide.
Still moving pretty slow, but it'll get.
No worries. And then the next slide just has a couple of things. It has contact information. If you have questions, feel free to contact your LAMD liaison or email the SLP inbox. It also provides a URL to CalRecycle's capacity planning for food recovery webpage and links to the 3 tools and guidance documents that we discussed today, in addition to a 4th guidance document on how to identify, or 4th tool on how to identify SB 1383 commercial edible food generators that was presented at a previous webinar. And with that, we will be taking questions until the end of the webinar.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you. So the questions that we have now are coming from the SLCP inbox. So the first one is from Dave Ghirardelli with Sacramento County, who is asking, of the over 1 million tons of potentially edible food in need of capacity planning, how many tons of that was definitively determined by CalRecycle to be safely edible within the constraints of the California Retail Food Code?
So I can start, and then I'm going to pass it off to Laura, since she is so familiar with the 2018 waste characterization study. What's critical to note in that phrasing of the question is that this is not potentially edible food that was measured. It was edible food that was potentially donatable. So when the sorters are out in the field, they're having to make a judgment call. We had very extensive sorting rules to make sure that we were sorting so that there would be as little level of uncertainty as possible. But with that said, it's the nature of a waste characterization study that there will be some level of uncertainty. So I'm going to pass it off to Laura because I know she has a lot more detail about that.
Thanks, Martine. And what you said is exactly correct. CalRecycle has a variety of sorting rules in order to get the best possible estimate for that edible food that we believe to be potentially donatable. However, we aren't able to confirm with 100% certainty that the food that we did include in that was, prior to discard, able to be safely recovered. So instead, as I mentioned, we use a proxy for trying to determine this. So it's food that is disposed whole, that was untouched. So imagine a whole watermelon. If we were to find that during the waste characterization study, it would be considered potentially donatable. However, if we found, for instance, a cut in half watermelon, that would be put in the not donatable category. The second proxy that we use to try to get at this potentially donatable question is whether the food was discarded in unopened original packaging. So again, this would be the manufacturer's packaging. If, for instance, spinach was discarded in a bag and still closed and it was the original packaging, we would put that in the potentially donatable category. However, if, say, that bag of spinach was opened or that spinach had been put in something like a Ziploc bag, so was not original packaging, it would be put in the not donatable category of edible food. So again, just to reiterate here, we weren't able to confirm whether things would have been safe to rescue at the time of discard, but we are using very stringent sorting rules and proxies to get the best available estimate.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Toby Mitchell with Ventura County Public Works Department. They had a question also regarding the over 1 million pounds of potentially donatable food disposed in California. They ask, do you have this data available at the county level?
Laura, I'm going to have Laura answer that question, but I do want to emphasize that it's not 1 million pounds, it's over 1 million tons. So that's billions of pounds. But I'll turn it over to Laura to see if that data is available at the county level and where that data can be accessed.
Awesome, thank you. So that data is derived from the 2018 disposal facility-based waste characterization study. And unfortunately, we do not have that information down to the granular level of a county based on how the waste characterization was completed. This is a statewide number for these. We do have some potential, we can break it down potentially by regions, but I would have to check back in with the details on that with the waste characterization team. And so if we want to follow up offline, we can get you more details on that.
Thank you. And it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in through either the SLCP inbox or through the chat. But if you have any other questions, feel free to ask them on there so that we can get those answered during the remaining time that we have for this webinar.
And yeah, we can wait for several minutes to see if anything comes in. And if nothing does, then we can also end the webinar early. And if you find that you have a question that we didn't have the opportunity to answer, you can send it to us and we will get back to you.
Okay, and we have another question from Sarah regarding contracts and written agreements. You are now unmuted on our end. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and then you can ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, this is Sarah Fite with the San Diego Food System Alliance. I know this question is a little bit different than the specific tools that were covered in the webinar today, but I think it's been mentioned a few times regarding relationships with food banks. And I had a question specifically around the contracts and written agreements that commercial edible food generators are going to be required to hold with food recovery organizations. And services. And the specific question is, we've noticed in our region that, generators, a lot of generators do have kind of a corporate relationship with the regional food banks, or they have a direct contract with the food bank. And the food bank is the one that's holding the contracts with the food recovery agencies. And we're wondering if these existing contracts are in place, does that meet the conditions and requirements of the regulation? Or will the generators have to establish new contracts with all of the individual food recovery organizations that are rescuing from them?
It's a great question, Sarah, and thank you so much for asking it. This is Martine. The answer is they do not need to go out and create new contracts. CalRecycle specifies in the regulations that a contract or a written agreement for food needs to be established. If that contract or written agreement already exists, then they don't need to create a new one. Now, we have been hearing from some food banks that they would like to have, because as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, food banks oftentimes are working with many feeding agencies. The food bank will call the feeding agency, and as a brief reminder for anyone on the call who's not familiar with food banking, the food bank will call one of their feeding agencies and say, this donor has food available, can you go and get it? So they're facilitating this donation, where then that feeding agency is actually distributing the food directly to individuals, whereas the food bank typically is not distributing food directly to an individual, they're distributing food to other feeding agencies. When the food bank then facilitates that donation, the feeding agency that's one of their partners will report that back to the food bank. So we have gotten some questions from food banks saying, can we have one blanket agreement that is done at the food bank level? And that's really up to the food bank and these generators to determine on their own. With that said, what is absolutely critical is that if a food recovery organization, let's say it's one of the food banks partnering feeding agency, wants to have their own agreement, they absolutely can do that. So it's just something to be aware of, that the food bank might want to be the only entity that has that contract for all of their feeding agencies. And if that works for them and works for their feeding agencies, that could be okay. But there are many feeding agencies out there that will not want that, that will want a separate agreement where they're rescuing food outside of their partnership with the food bank. So it's just something to keep in mind and be mindful of. But Sarah, to your original question, so I'm sorry I kind of went off on a tangent there, but to your original question, they do not need to a new contract or written agreement because they already have one.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, Martine. And kind of a follow-up in with respect to record keeping, if, in the scenario where the food banks are the ones holding the contracts and that's sufficient for meeting regulation, do the individual generators from a record keeping perspective need to have copies of those contracts available on site if a jurisdiction were to ask them, or kind of is just checking on the status of that? Or is it sufficient for the food bank to hold the contracts? And if someone were to ask, they could be directed to the food bank for reference of that document.
Yeah, also a very important question. So the requirement in the record keeping requirements for generators is that, and I apologize, someone's driving by very fast. The record keeping requirements specify that each generator has to maintain a copy of their contracts or written agreements with the food recovery organizations they work with on site. So, they have to have that there for enforcement purposes in case there is an inspection, so that they can verify, the enforcement official can verify that that generator, one, has a contract and that they are maintaining the proper records. So it needs to be on site, both at the generator level and for the food recovery organization. They should have a copy of that as well.
Great. Thank you so much for clarifying that.
Thanks, Sarah.
It looks like we got one more question in from Julia DeVore. Julia, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead and remind us of your affiliation and restate your question.
Hi, it's Julia from Community Environmental Council in Santa Barbara. It was covered, Sarah covered it in her follow-up. It was asking about if the local stores had to have those agreements and tracking on file at the local store, and it sounds like the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. And Julia, I'm sorry I didn't recognize it because you have a new last name, but it's great that you're on the webinar, and thank you for participating.
No, thank you.
The next question that came in is from Colleen Foster. Doesn't look like they can be unmuted, but I will go ahead and read the question. It says, how many years of records do generators need to keep their contracts on site for?
I know Kara has the answer to this question. Kara, are you still on the webinar? Or maybe Ashley, because I apologize, I do not know the exact number of years, and I don't want to give incorrect information, but there is a specified number of years that the records should be maintained.
Ashley, do you want to respond?
Oh, Kara, go ahead.
I believe it's 5 years, but I do want to double check that.
And then Colleen, something to also help you guys out is just as a note while Kara's double checking, is we are creating a model electronic record keeping tool. And this is for the jurisdiction side. That's supposed to be released, I think, within about a month or two, but don't hold me on that. But we're also going to be thinking about creating model record keeping things for like the generators, for the self-haulers, for the facility side of 1383. So that's something also to be on the lookout for, is that is another tool that we will hopefully be releasing soon.
All right, we still don't have any other questions, so we'll go ahead and give it a couple minutes while we still have some time on the webinar.
Okay, the team will stay online until 3:30, but if anyone needs to jump off, you're welcome to do so, but we will be here to answer your questions until 3:30. And for anyone that is jumping off of the webinar, we just want to say thank you so much for your engagement and participation today. And for those of you on the call that assisted with the development of these tools and provided your input, it was absolutely instrumental in the development of each of these tools, and we are grateful to you. So thank you so much.
Okay, there is another question from Colleen. She says, they say, thank you for the information. Are generators able to self-certify their records to jurisdictions through a virtual portal that generators can upload themselves?
I mean, this is Martine. I think I would need a little bit more context on that. It doesn't seem like that would not be allowable. The inspections, the on-site inspections, though, still need to occur. So maybe Kara or Ashley has something to add to that.
Hey, Colleen, this is Ashley. I think we need a little bit more information from you on this. There are inspection requirements, but again, with COVID and being safe out there, safety comes first for a lot of this stuff. So we probably just need to talk out your situation a little bit more. And I don't think you can unmute yourself, but let's have more conversations on this.
Another question from Monica White. You are now unmuted. Please go ahead and state your name and restate your question.
So it's Monica White from Edgar & Associates. And my question is really around the trigger for an implementation plan. Is the trigger just very clearly that we don't have existing capacity as it stands now for food recovery, and that starts a formal implementation plan? Or if we've been able to kind of discuss that we know in the next 12 months there's going to be some kind of investment and everybody's working together, does that remove the need for an implementation plan? Or like how is CalRecycle assessing that specific trigger when evaluating these capacity studies?
Thank you for that question, Monica. I don't know if Kara is still on the call. Kara would be the best suited to answer that question. And there might be more details in that where she would need to follow up with you offline. But Kara, are you still on the call? Or Ashley, do you want to address that? Kara might have had to hop off.
And we can, I can send it in and we can talk about it later too.
I think that would probably be best, just because there's a very specific response that would come from our capacity planning team. And I want to make sure that we give you all of the most accurate information.
Of course.
So this is Ashley. It just, again, I think this is another scenario one, Monica, that we should just take offline to talk about like what that gap is, how severe it is, etc. Because there are, scenarios where it may not be like super big, but there's some scenarios where it's like, yeah, we should really chat more offline and figure out, a good solution to demonstrate, that there are actions being taken place, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. That sounds great. I'll send you guys a question on an email. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica.
And it looks like we still have a little bit more time. Colleen did say that they cannot unmute themselves, but are interested in discussing in more detail at a separate meeting. And then one more question from Caitlin Haberlin regarding written agreements and contracts. You are now unmuted. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Again, this is Caitlin Haberlin with Santa Barbara County. I know this one is off topic, so please, no worries if you just want to chat with me later. But I just wanted to double check with the written agreements to see if they need to be signed by both parties, or if perhaps the donor can just write a letter explaining their partnership, because so many donors already have like a donation a donation procedure happening right now. And so it would be very easy for them to just write a letter explaining what they do, including all the details of like maximizing and some of the dates and times of donations that the regulations include. But yeah, so I just wanted to know what the limits are for that written agreement.
Hi, Caitlin. Thank you for the question. So this needs to be a formalized contract or written agreement, a letter saying that we have this agreement with this food bank, for example, that the generator has outlined would not be sufficient to meet that requirement. They do need to go to the organization or one or more that they're working with and have that formal agreement or contract where both parties have agreed to it. Otherwise, what you could have is a situation where the generator is saying, I have this agreement and this is what we do, and maybe they don't actually have the food recovery organization that they work with, or the food recovery organization says that's not what's going on. So this is really to verify compliance with the requirements that are in these regulations. If that generator, for any generator, for example, did not have a formal contract or written agreement, CalRecycle did develop a model food recovery agreement. It is on the CalRecycle Education and Outreach Resources webpage. the SB 1383 Education and Outreach Resources webpage. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page, it will list our model tools, and one of them is the Model Food Recovery Agreement. It doesn't have to be used, but it can be used. And really what it is a customizable food recovery agreement that can be used by the generators and food recovery organizations to meet their specific or unique needs. But what is critical is that both parties are agreeing to it. And then at that point, that document could be kept on site and shown to an enforcement official to verify compliance. So I hope that that answered the question.
Yeah, that is helpful. Do the written agreements need to be signed?
I think that, this is something that, I would need to verify with our legal team, but in order for it to be an agreement, my inclination would be that both parties agreeing to the terms would need to sign it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So we are at 3:30. With that, I think that we can conclude. Again, just really want to emphasize the gratitude for all of you participating and for your engagement in this process. We hope that you find these tools helpful. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much.